Good afternoon. My name is Miguel Ángel Beltrán Gutierrez, and I'm from Teachers Deborah 7M class, and I want to talk about what does terrorism really is. We hear the word terrorism a lot. Despite its concept and it's notoriously hard to explain, there is no international consensus on the definition legally or academically for the term terrorism. In fact, the USA government has more than 20 definitions for it. And in 1996, the UN formed its own ad hoc committee to draft the official explanation of the term and took as long as 10 years to. So, what exactly constitutes terrorism? A mix of terrorism definitions resumes in something like this. Terrorism is violence or the threat or violence against non-combatants or civilians, usually motivated by political, religious, or ideological beliefs. Outside that broad definition, it might be better to explain terrorism by talking about what it's not. Terrorism is not organized crime. There's a few key differences. In one is the motivation. Terrorism is usually political or socially motivated, and organized crime is profit motivated. Secondly, people on organized crime usually do not seek attention of the media, something terrorists do. And third, organized crime does not usually desire government recognition, unlike most of terrorist groups. Terrorism is not violence carried out by one mentally ill person. This can be confusing because when it comes to violent acts, it's not immediately apparent who is sane and who is insane. For example, a man called Harun Moniz took hostages in an Australia cafe on December 2014. He claimed that it was an official attack on Australia by the Islamic State. However, after the siege ended, many people, including Australia's Prime Minister, agreed that he was mentally ill at the time and that this should not be considered as terrorism or he as a terrorist. Moniz was killed in the siege and his true intentions and affiliations remain unknown. Research shows that about 40% of lone attacks are perpetrated by mentally ill individuals. Terrorism is not violence perpetrated by a government against another nation. A nation commits an act of violence. It's usually referred to as an act of war, or under some circumstances as an act of self-defense. There are some exceptions to this rule, of course. If a nation indirectly commits an act of terrorism by founding a terrorist organization or covertly organizing the terrorist act, that's still considered by some, like Mexico or the United States, to be a terrorist action. Terrorism also is not an act of violence by a government against its own people, because countries like Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia had a history of terrorizing its own civilians, but those were generally considered to be as acts of oppression or repression and not terrorism. These definitions are based on how the United Nations and many international scholars interpret these terms. And if you disagree or have a dissenting opinion, you are not alone. As I said in the top of speech, terrorism is notoriously hard to define and often used by many to mean different things by intellectuals, politicians, and the media. But it's one of today's most big problems, and it's attempting against peace, international peace. So it's a very important issue.